Sirs! Josh here. And yes, we have already had our first update to the Codex. Now, I am not at all surprised by this. Creating something like the Codex, an incredibly complex and involved document, which also included many tweaks to the rules in order to streamline them, was never going to result in a perfect product the first time around. Especially when you consider that it's not like there were 10,000 people consulting on this and running through all the scenarios. So, the Codex came out, discussions were had about what about this, what about that, and a few minor changes were made. Now, if you watched my live stream that just happened over the weekend, you will know that the thing that I have kind of been obsessing over is the ongoing effects section of the Codex and the timestamps that are involved in that and the application of it and how involved it is and the changes that new system of an order of applying those effects, how it has changed the game. That has now been updated. In addition, there's another small update that certain members of the community are not going to be happy about. So let's cover that one first. The very first is 3 cards were clarified as being silence effects. Namely, silence. Right? Yeah, that's a silence. Silence is a silence effect. Yes. Next, Sisters of Silence is a silence effect. Makes perfect sense. Now here's the one that some people aren't going to like. Magnetic Muzzle is a silence effect, and it no longer affects avatars. So and some of you may be saying, what are you talking about? How would an avatar ever get the magnetic muzzle? Well, through Cordis and Theus, and you take control of your opponent and you say, hey, go pick that up. That thing that's sitting on the ground. And that's how you did it. You could take control of your opponent's avatar, have them pick up the muzzle, and then they would lose all their abilities. So, because of that, basically the game would end. Some people like that, because if you were able to pull it off, 1, it's incredible to pull it off. And then 2, it pretty much ends the game. There's no question. Your avatar cannot cast any more spells. Yeah, it's over. It's done. So that was kind of neat, but I didn't like that. I didn't like the idea that your avatar was nullified. Even though, I will admit, getting it to happen was involved. It was complex. It, in a way, I think is rewarding to the player that did it. And certain opponents would be like, well, that's pretty fun. And then they'd end the game. But I think some people would get very frustrated that their avatar would literally not be able to cast spells anymore. So, Magnetic Muzzle, sorry, no more ending games by having your opponent's avatar pick that up when you used Courtesan. Back to, though, the main point. And those clarifications were tied to this main point. Ongoing effects and their order of application. So, originally, there were 7 steps in the order of applying ongoing effects. Step 4 was the level that I was most concerned about, especially in my live stream. And if any of you folks want to see that, apparently it's not showing up on searches. I'm going to drop it in the description of this video if you want to go take a look at me trying to do a live. But I talk about ongoing effects quite a bit. So, step 4 involved applying ability adding and removing effects, disabling effects, and affinity changing effects. Now, the reason I hated the way those were all combined was because it brought back into play the root spider versus tide naiads issue. That has been something that has gone back and forth throughout the history of sorcery. And basically, at one point the tide naiads were winning. At one point the root spiders were winning. Under the new system that was just 7 steps, it was going to be based on their timestamp. So if the root spider had come into play in an earlier turn, it would beat tide naiads that had come into play in a later turn, and vice versa. But that could get very confusing if, say, I have 2 root spiders on the board and you have 2 tide naiads on the board. We have to timestamp all those cards, knowing that one of the tide naiads might be able to beat out one of my root spiders, but not the other. Whereas one of my root spiders beats both of your tide. No, that was what I was like, ugh, this sounds messy. So I didn't like that those were all bundled together. And the good news, they're not anymore. So we now have 8 steps, 8 glorious steps. And then this step was also added because within the original 7 steps, a king of the realm could not lose his ability to control because control was step 2. So you would apply controlling things at step 2, and you'd apply disabling things at step 4 or silencing things at step 4. And just so everyone knows, silence was not clarified in the actual 7-step structure, but adding and removing abilities, that's silence, right? That's what silence does. So silence was tucked in 4 as well. So the king would take control of stuff, and then he could never lose this ability, and so he would keep control. So it was a bit of a bungled mess. Apparently the judges had discussed it because that had come up, and then I wobbled into one of the rules channels and brought it up, and then it just I muddled it even more. I made it a total mess. So I'm glad that this clarification came out, and the judges already knew. They had already talked it over. This fix was already in the progress when I had stumbled into it. So now we have 8 steps. So number 1 is always copy. Mirror realm, that's a copy effect. We apply it first. Number 2, instead of being control effects under the 7 steps, number 2 is now disabling effects and silencing effects. Yes, because step 3 is control effects like King of the Realm. So now, if Bower is out in play, silencing mortals, its silence effect will affect the king before his control effect comes into place. So he will be silenced. Perfect. In addition to that, because disabling effects have been pulled into step 2, that now means that root spiders will always win over tide naiads, because tide naiads are still in step 4, affinity changing effects. They flood a site, that is an affinity changing effect. So the root spider is always going to win out. I will say, I've always kind of wanted the tide naiads to win, just because root spider is so powerful. And now we're in a place where it is going to be, more powerful, because one of the effects that potentially, granted, I don't think anyone was really playing tide naiads in competitive play at events, but, it was nice for casual games. It was nice for the limited games. It was a nice way to get rid of that root spider potentially under the rule set where they won. Now we're back to, because the root spider's effect will be applied at step 2, and the tide naiads will be applied at step 4, the root spider is always going to win. So that is it in a nutshell. Instead of having 7 steps for applying ongoing effects, we now have 8 steps. Not a huge deal, but important enough that it matters. For those of you who are considering, judging, who are excited about Eric's Curiosa's judging program, I heartily encourage you to really get that ongoing effects chart in your head. Know those 8 steps. Know the order. I actually planned on having a whole video focused on that, and I may still do it because there could be more changes. But I wanted to get this out there now because I thought it was very important to say immediately, we've already had a small change to the Codex. Here's what it is. Take a look at it. And I think it's important, especially with us approaching Gen Con, that we know what that order is and that all of you as players at least have an idea. Again, the Codex really isn't meant for casual play. Most competitive players aren't going to be really diving into it. But take a read. Take a read of that ongoing effects section. Just take a look at it. I really think it's very beneficial, that you can pull that order up whenever you need to. I think that section is going to be crucial for play in the future because we're going to get more and more ongoing passive effects. And we're going to need to know that order. So there it is. That is it. I'm looking forward to more from the Codex. And I will say, don't be surprised if there's some more changes, some more minor clarifications. That's fine. Sorcery is a very complex game when you dive down into the weeds. At the surface level, it can be very simple, especially because we don't really, in a game, interact with each other as players. So that helps simplify it. But man, when you get to some of these things that we're talking about, this is where the complexity is at. Weird interactions like this. So I will say, if you're out there and you're like, man, I really wish I could interact with my opponent more. If you get down to the brass tacks of this game, it's pretty complex, very complex. All the effects that can be going on at the same time, applying them in the right order. So I don't know that I want to layer on top of that, in your opponent's turn, you can do X, Y, or Z. It just makes it even more difficult to make sure that we have a clear, concise rule set. We know what's going to happen, especially for the judges, right? That's the big thing. We need the judges to be confident in the decisions that they're making and the rule set that they're playing under. That's what we need. So that's it. Yeah, I think I covered it all. So, as always, keep on contesting the realm!